Hey, good afternoon. It's good to see you all. One last time, we had a very long and intense semester full of wonderful presentations. And today is the last in our lecture series on creativity on practice for LNS 25, a special course to introduce people to the range of creative activities in the University of California. And we could do this course for another 2 or 3 years. There's so many more speakers that we didn't have a chance to introduce, but today our guest speaker is going to be Carmine-Emanuele, who's a composer and a mathematician, and who's going to speak about finding his creative voice and about temporal structures, which will be the basis for your final project, creating a sonic atmosphere, which I'm really looking forward to listening to next week. So um, our slide here is showing, in fact, one of the installations of Carmine-Emanuele's at their lab in CINMAT, the Center for New Acoustic and Music Technology, over at Art Street. It's part of campus, but it's not on campus. And it's a wonderful building full of magical tools and systems to generate sounds unheard before, and also other ones that have been heard before and time honored. And here's a setup that shows two drums connected to each other through their vibrations. And Carmen is going to explain more exactly what this is all about. But I think this image is very evocative because it shows how sometimes we have to build all kinds of things in order to really bring our voice forward. Little systems that help us amplify our voice, I guess. And there's a technical component to that to make it louder, but there's also a emotional component to that that's very important. And I recently was looking at Omicron data concerning the virus and looking at how people respond to data. There's so many facts in the world that we respond to emotionally. And so just having the facts is not enough, because when we have the facts, we have to interpret them. And when we interpret the facts, then we are really doing something creative. A creative act is to figure out what the meaning of something is, and that creative act, of course, is loaded with emotions and with expectations, cultural expectations, and biases. And even a simple fact as looking at the spread of a virus is loaded with potential to understand things clearly or to misunderstand things clearly. And I'm just baffled by how many misinterpretations of incoming data we get, even though we have a lot of evidence to the contrary. So in particular, how from the Omicron information that we had, we concluded first that, oh, we have to stop all flights from South Africa, but it turned out that was not really effective, and that wasn't really the problem. So we're trying to sort of respond emotionally to things, and sometimes the emotions aren't quite right. So getting the right emotional response is a deep and very important aspect of living your life in a creative way, because your emotions are something you create, you cultivate, and finding the right way to respond to something is fundamentally creative. So when we do this kind of exercises where we look at the world and we try to interpret it, or we rewrite a poem, or we listen for a sound, it's not just about some abstract exercise. It really is about how do we interpret the world in the most meaningful way possible. And when we interpret it wrong, then we take actions that are not helpful, and that's one thing to look out for. So as you're preparing for your exam, I'd like you to think about the lectures we had in those terms, like not in terms of just knowledge and facts, but in terms of how people made you feel. So if you look at this list of speakers that we've had, starting with Grace O'Connell, we talked about the materials that she's growing in her lab that are going inside our tissues, between our bones, and say Lisa Wymore and how she was dancing on stage with a whole group of dancers. Bikram and how he was talking about his ink pen that he had as a student in school in India, and Alex and her forms, and the poems that came out of the forms, and Marty and her discussions about what makes sense, what is useful information. Each of these speakers, they gave us information, but they also gave us some kinds of feelings. And when you review for this exam, I want you to be able to look at this image and say, oh yeah, this one made me feel this way, this one made me feel that way, and so forth. And that'll give you a really good sense of how to prepare for this exam, where we'll ask questions about how you made sense of what happened here. Not is it right or is it wrong, but what sense did it make to you? So it's not an exam where you can be getting a good grade by getting it right, quote unquote, but by getting it, by telling me or telling us, the GSIs and me, how things made sense to you. And so that's what it's all about, really, making sense of the world. Excuse me. So with that, I'm going to take a moment to introduce our speaker today, Carmine-Emanuele. And so I'm very honored to be able to work with Carmine in various capacities, including thinking about a new media master's that we're developing together with a group of grad students, and asking ourselves, well, what kind of education do we need to give people on the master's level in order to help them make sense of the world with media and technology, with art and technology. And so that's been a wonderful experience to go through. Carmine is from Italy, and he studied in the Conservatory of Music. First, he got a diploma in piano in 1998. This is quite interesting because you can see that his education is extremely deep. So if you want to be interdisciplinary, you have to study two things, not one. And that means that you actually have to spend decades studying music and decades studying math, in this case, in order to really get that synthesis that you're looking for. And so that's exactly what he did. He got a diploma in piano in 1998, in computer music in 2002, composition 2003, and then at the PhD level, he got a PhD in composition in 2007 in Rome, and then he got a second PhD in math in 2011. And then he was ready to embark on his career, which is really a synthesis of the two topics of math and music in various different ways. And one of his signature pieces that was completed in 2013 was called Reflets de l'ombre, or Reflections of the Shadow. And since 2019, he's an assistant professor at SINM at Berkeley, and we're so lucky to have him. So we're completing this lecture series, which I mentioned last time, which began with our body tissues. We'll complete this lecture series with the most abstract kind of experience, which is just hearing the sound of something moving. While these experiments represent perhaps the most abstract form of creativity, they nevertheless have the potential to resonate with our innermost tissues and with our outermost worries, all the way from, the core of our bones to the viruses in the world, and therefore allow us to feel in ways we never felt before. With that, please join me in welcoming Carmine-Emanuele. So make us feel like we never felt before.
Thanks so much, Greg. Thanks for this nice introduction. And thank you very much for inviting me today. It's a pleasure for me to be here. And I just wanted to show you some of my work and a little bit of my word, so to speak. So the title is New Sounds. I'm not sure about the title either. So let's see if we will find any new sound today, okay? I'll try to give you a brief history of everything in 1 hour or something. So let's see if it works. I start from my family, okay? So this is my mom, and she loves Beethoven, and she loves his music, and I'll talk about that in a minute, okay? So I'm saying that because of a reason. And then my father actually didn't care, and he didn't really like music, and he doesn't like music today. But I love them. And then this is me, and as Greg mentioned, I'm kind of in between a couple of things, musical composition being the primary aim of my research, but I also studied math, and I somehow put the things together with creative computing. So in other words, if I have to kind of describe my work in a nutshell, I would say the question comes from music, the modeling comes from math, and the solution comes from computers, or something like that. So, and then they're in feedback, so everything affects everything else. So basically, that's my kind of space for the moment. Let me give you some history in terms of geography. So as Greg mentioned, I was born in Italy. There I was eating pasta, and I learned orchestration. And cooking pasta and orchestrating is somehow similar, right? So you put some of that, and then you have kind of a new recipe. And maybe even if you have two things that are independently good, you put them together, and they are not good together. So that's Nutella and mayonnaise, for example, right? So, I learned how to orchestrate. That was the main thing, I would say, for those years. And then I moved to France, and I started eating camembert. And there, I would say, I started organizing my thoughts and understanding the importance of structure and the importance of time and how much time affects the structure. And there I somehow connected my math work with my music work. And as Greg mentioned, in 2013, I composed this piece that I will present in a minute called Reflet de l'ombre, in which I basically put together the research from my PhD in math with the research from my PhD in music. And it was kind of the first real moment in my life in which I've seen the thing happening for real. And then since then, I didn't stop. Then I moved to the US, right? And then, well, you know what's that. So you put everything together here, right? So we have a bunch of things that are very diverse, very rich, and that's new. And I don't know how this will go and where this will bring me. But for the moment, I am at CENMAT, the Center for New Music and Audio Technology here at Berkeley. It's a very diverse place that has a very nice history. Like it was founded around the 80s, and there is a lot of research that is interdisciplinary, this strange world today. Like, so we have musicians, mathematicians, computer scientists, psychologists, and historians, and whatever. So it's a nice, diverse place. So please come visit us when you can. The talk is called New Sounds. So I figured I would start with the sounds that shaped my life. Okay, so that's maybe the best way for me to present my work. And so the first sound is my mom, right? So Beethoven. So this is a manuscript, and there is some sort of tomato sauce on the page. It's real, it's not a joke. And so this is the 9th symphony. I'd like to play for you the beginning of this symphony, like few 30, 40 seconds of the thing. I'll play that twice because I want to point out something, okay? Let's do. Okay, I stop here. So, yeah, I know, coitus interruptus, right? Yes. So what happens is that, in my opinion here, these two, so there is a beginning moment of this symphony that is very different from the kind of the second part of this 30 seconds, so to speak. The first part is, there are no melodies, there are no real chords, there are no real rhythms. It's just somehow a sound. On the other hand, in the second part, there is a theme, there is a melody. That is very, strong, so to speak, and it works on a different kind of perceptual level. Let's play it again. So the first, I would say 15 seconds is just about sound, and the last 15 seconds is about melodies, harmonies, and rhythm. Okay, let's see if you agree with that. So it feels to me that we were underwater, and at some point we surfed somehow, and then we now see things and hear things in a different way. This was kind of something going all day long when I was a kid. My mother was used to play these symphonies like basically 24/7, and so I was immersed in this type of music, and something happened in my mind, right? So, but then a few years later, when I was 6, I met this guy here, the Commodore 64, and I started, I developed some sort of interest to this object, And I started writing code. And the first thing I wanted to do was to make music with these code. And so let me play a few examples. And then, so you will see that there is some code that corresponds to some sounds. So what happens here is that the system generates a sequence of characters, a stream of characters. Then you put these, you play them with the speakers, and you get these kind of rhythms or sounds. I was hooked. It was incredible for me. Like you can generate numbers, and this would generate sounds, and there is a kind of this type of connection. So I was a kid. I was used to pass a few hours per day before going to school writing code for Commodore 64. My mother was not okay with that. She would prefer much more that I would listen to Beethoven instead, right? So, and I actually kept doing that. And I must say, I never stopped till today. I even found a job doing that, you know, so it's crazy. So at the same time, I was interested in composing, right? So this is my very first piece. It's called Trillo Allegro. And I composed when I was six. And you see there is a few mistakes, okay? For example, this bar is supposed to have 4/4, and then there are 5. And this was some of my inspiration for the next years. Can we put more into less? And this was, can we use computers to figure out how we put more into less? How we pack things that are not meant to be together in a way. So this idea of tiling and putting things that have different shapes and cover a space evenly. This was one of the motivations of my future work. So just for the sake of discussion, I wanted to show you my very first composition. Thank you. Okay. Then, I grew up. I was at this conservatory, as Greg mentioned, and I was studying computer music with this person, Eugenio Giordani. Eugenio was a genius. In fact, we used to say Eugenio Giordani, and it means Giordani is a genius. And he was a composer and an engineer. So for the first time, I met someone that was actually able to write code and compose music at the same time. It was kind of a revelation for me. I was not alone, right? I wanted to do that, and other people could do that. He taught me everything about computer music. And I'd like to play, so he passed away last year for COVID. He got COVID and passed away. So I'd like to play a few seconds of a piece of Eugenio called Solaria. This was the very first piece for computer-generated sounds that I've ever heard when I was a kid. And this was a big epiphany for me. Like, I understood that we could actually make sound with computers and make sounds that sound like Beethoven and not like just crap sounds as we played with the Commodore. So it was kind of a point where I actually realized that we can actually express ourselves with this type of sounds that are not using instruments, but new instruments, in this case, the computer. Let me play a few seconds of this piece. This piece is called Solaria. So for some reasons that I don't even know, I don't understand even today, this music, it's very close for me to the very first 30 seconds of Beethoven's symphony. Like these are the same type of attitude for sound. It's something that relates to timbre more than other parameters. And so I wanted to know more. So I started studying these technology in order to be able to express myself using this technology. By the way, this piece has been composed using something called granular synthesis. Is a way to make sounds by putting together small grains of sound. You hear that here in these small events, right? So if you can control the texture, the density, the distribution. It's kind of a probabilistic approach to sound. And it's a very interesting way. By the way, this technique has been an important technique for sound design in the last 20 years, like for movies, for example, many sound effects have been designed using these type of technique. So let me go back to my slides. So Eugenio was a capital figure for my work. And then, at some point I wanted to be able to develop new ideas and new instruments to make these new sounds. I would say that this revelation for me was a kind of a shift from something that was like symbolic to something that was more perceptual. Like, for example, I realized how melodies actually for me were not really the thing. I was interested in streams, like how we have streams or layers of sounds together, and how rhythm was not really the thing for me, and I was more interested in density, like how can we control the density of a process. And then harmony or chords were actually a kind of a short description of something that I would define today texture or color or timbre in general. So generally speaking, I would say that I was more interested in passing from symbols that you learn at school, like harmony, chord, melody, rhythms, or pitches, to sounds. You actually are more related to perception. And so my question became at that point, then if Beethoven was thinking in notes and thinking in instruments and thinking in chords or harmonies, can we actually think in sounds? Can we compose and use sounds as the primary object of our creative model? And this is the question that informs my research today. Can we think in sounds? And generalizing, what is the mental model that an artist uses during the creative process? And eventually, can we use mathematics to model, support, or discover this mental model? Is there a way to connect a formalized language such as mathematics to this kind of creative effort that you do when you create music or create images or you do your own art? So for me, the question is about sounds. Like I realized how I'm interested in using sound when I think, and I do think using sounds. And so the question is, can we use computers and other type of technologies or formalized languages to support this type of thinking in order to either speed up or discover new ideas, basically. And this is basically the space in which I am today. At CENMAT, let's say that the work is about how can we invent new sounds using technology to make new music. And this actually is a kind of a feedback loop between the three things. And then everything goes, there is no real separation between the things for me. So mathematics and music creation became a single kind of language for me. And I tried to stay in this kind of space, okay? So to use a metaphor, I would say, if we think that music is like the sea, we can think there is a type of music that is music with sounds, that is a music based on symbols like chords, melodies. This would be the second half of Beethoven, right? But at the same time, there is a music within sound. That is a music in which you compose the sound itself, the timbre. It's not a side effect of the chord. It's the primary aim, composing the sound. I compose the sound from within. In other words, this engages two different types of processes. One is that you use some sort of algebra of quantities when you use symbols. Like I have a chord, I want to transpose the chord, multiply the chord by a rhythm by another value and increase the scale or something like that. So you use quantities and you make an algebra of that quantities, of those quantities. Whereas when you compose music within sound, you want to define the timbre space, and it's more analyzing the qualities of the sound. So you actually are interested in finding new perceptual qualities of a sound. Well, to be honest, I think perception needs both. So that's why Beethoven is Beethoven, right? So he was aware, in a sense, that both the timbre space, the space of sounds, the space of perception, and the space of chords, harmony, and rhythms is actually connected. And these two spaces, are connected, and you want to go from one to the other continuously. So, in other words, I would say that a composer could find their own space in these kind of, C. Either you stay on the symbolic level, or you go on the timbre level, or you find a position in between the two. And I can and will mention a few composers that are actually either in one case or the other, or in some specific space. And I would say that in the history of music, we always had this kind of dualities in history. So we had couples of composers that were actually either more on symbols or more on sounds, on timbres. This was true from Bach and Handel, for example, to Mozart and Beethoven, and to Boulez and Grise. So in a sense, this is a trend. And when you are a composer, you want to understand where you are. So my question was then, where is my place here in this C? Where do I stand? Well, the short answer is, I don't know. Okay, so that's what I'm saying. But in order to give you some examples of my work, after understanding this idea of new sounds, I started composing them and putting them together in order to have new music. So I'd like to discuss maybe 2 or 3 projects that I created in the last few years, in which all these dimensions actually work together to make music, both the technological dimension, the mathematical dimension, and the artistic dimension, in a sense. The first piece I'd like to discuss is the one that Greg mentioned too, Reflet de l'Ombre. This was a large production for orchestra and live electronics. It's been a co-production by IRCAM and Radio France, and had a very long production period, almost 2 years of production. And this was a piece for 130 musicians on the stage, and 3D audio on 3 levels. So the salle Pleyel, the place where the piece has been played, had 3 kind of levels. And so we had to make 3 times a 3D space. So it was a nightmare of cables, so to speak. And in this piece, I composed a piece using the technology that I developed during my PhD in math. So this was the official moment in which these 2 careers somehow met. And for me, it was important because I realized that, in fact, you cannot find your own space and define yourself in a way that is unique. And you can do, basically, you can find your voice. This was my way to find my own voice, in a sense. Let me give you an example of this piece. So to me, this piece was what I would call composing within sound. So the second kind of type of composition. And you see here a sort of a dream versus reality type of thing. On the left, you see the sketches that I would jot down on a page to design the timbre of this music. And then on the right, on the left, no, on the right, you see the real page, the thing that finally became the piece. Between the two, there are 6 months of work or something. And I actually developed tools to go from this stage to the other stage. And that's what I would call computer-assisted composition or computer-assisted creation. I developed a number of tools that would help me to speed up the process so that I would actually focus more on the musical level and less on the technical level, and automating whatever I could in order to speed up this kind of process. So from abstract ideas to real notes to be played by real people. Let me give you an example. I tried to pull up this thing this morning to see if it works, because now it's quite some time. Let me see if I can find it, okay? So that will be the geeky section of the talk, okay? So give it a second. Yes. So I go to the folder in which I have a number of compositions. Here we go. This is a set of tools that I developed for the piece. One is called Gen Diets, and you give it a number of a set of numbers that corresponds to pitches, and it does a number of things. So it generates matrices and connections and synthesizes something that is corresponding to this type of thing. And then, in fact, it generates graphs of the harmonic layout of the piece. So this is automatically generated, and it was used during the compositional stage to drive the harmonic reasoning of the piece, and actually is connected to the rhythm in a way. So I made some sort of connections, and so if you go back to the slide here, you see that these P fields, P25, P whatever, they correspond to these boxes in the graph. So I would actually connect these two things in a kind of formal way. So this tool was an automation. So I knew what to do. It took too much time, so I wanted to automate that. That was the kind of the answer, okay? So again, the question was musical. I knew what to want to do. I need to find the model. In that case, it was kind of a dyadic division of pitches. And then I implemented that using computers to make this process quick. I guess we can play maybe a small section of the piece, okay? If is that okay for you? Let's see. Okay, so what we will hear is, so the piece was for orchestra and live electronics, and the live electronics was listening to the orchestra and then reacting to the orchestra. So in the section we will play here will be the reaction of the electronics. So you will have the first half that is still the orchestra, and the second half that is what the electronic, so to speak, learned and then reacted to. By the way, I do something here. This is a sort of orchestral version of a acoustic paradox called the Shepherd glissando. It's an infinite type of glissando that you can actually create using computers, but not for real using instruments. But I try to do that using the orchestra. So you will have this kind of feeling of an infinite glissando. I hope so. Thank you. Thank you. So in the second half of this recording, you have a sort of real shape of glissando, and this has been generated by the electronics after listening to this kind of fake orchestral version of the shape of glissando. This was using something that is called the sound type. The sound type is something I developed during the PhD and has been used as a tool at IRCAM for a number of years for other musical productions, and is basically meant to learn. It was one of my first experiences with machine learning for sound and creation, and it was an important project for me. Let me show you another piece of mine called Stade d'ombre, Stade de lumière. That is a piece for large ensemble in this case, in which I used a very different strategy to compose the piece. So it's a few years later. And the idea is that I wanted to use a computer to help me orchestrate. So instead of finding the orchestration by myself, I would give a system a sound called the target sound, and the system would find the orchestral equivalent of that sound. What you see here is my project, again, the abstract version of the piece. And then these sounds, these sonograms that you see on the left are actually the real sounds that came out after the performance. So just to show you that there was a clear connection between my idea that was kind of very abstract and the final sound that came out of the piece. How did I do that? Well, I developed a software called Orchidea that I will show you in a minute that is able to help you orchestrating. And the way it works is that you give it a sound and you find the orchestral equivalent of that sound. It's a kind of a combinatorial problem under constraints, so technically speaking. And the way it works is that, let me give you an example of how it works. So the software is implemented as a package for Max MSP. That is a software for music and sound creation. So it's kind of a subset of this software. And you can still use and download it today. Is currently developed. There is a community behind this software. It's a number of composers and researchers that use the software also for pedagogy. So is used to teach orchestration actually. And let me give you an example, okay, of how it works. And then I will show you this piece, Stade d'ombre, how I use the software for myself. Okay, so the idea is that you want to help, well, some help in orchestrating a given sound. So how did I use this software for myself? So I decided to take the sound of a bell, orchestrate the sound of a bell, and then compose a piece with that sound. By the way, this piece is made by 7 sections. Each section has a different target sound. So we'll just hear now the very first section for 2 minutes, and I'll play the original sound, one of the possible orchestrations that Orchidea generated, and then the way I use the orchestration for real in a piece. So we will play the recording of the real performance of the piece. So the sound is just this one. It's a bell. So Orchidea can generate a number of solutions. I just play one random solution here. In this case, you see that the timbre is quite okay, not the best, but that's what I chose when I wanted to compose the piece for some reasons. And so what did I do with that sound? I composed this section here. Okay, so I think this illustrates something that's very important for me. All the technology you can develop or the support you can get from a machine is just a poetic inspiration for your work. So it's not composing for you. I'm not using computers to compose for me. I'm using computers to get some inspiration and then use this inspiration to make my own music. So in other words, there is a kind of a detachment between the technical outcomes of a system that I develop for music making and the way I use it for creating my music. So my music is not my system. They are not the same thing. That's, I think it's an important distinction that I want to point out, because it's easy today to get confused, and then you have so many things that you can use for making sounds, but there's no way that these things can compose for you. So your voice is unique, and you need to actually use the things that you have to build your voice, not the other way around, not adapt your voice to the tools. And that's kind of a tricky problem. Sometimes when a tool is too powerful, you have no space. When it's not powerful enough, you have no use. So I guess it's not easy to design something that is usable enough, but open enough to leave some space for creation. So I think these are the center of my research too, like how you design tools for supporting music creation. Let me go to the last section of my talk. There is also new instruments. So at the beginning, I was talking about new sounds, like these sounds that come out from systems such as a computer that I didn't even imagine when I was a kid was possible. And then you can make new music, meaning something that is a combination of new sounds that creates some sort of unique way for you to express yourself. But finally, you can actually go even further down the line and say, you know what, I even designed my own instruments, and I want now to make new music and new sounds using new instruments. So let me give you an example of this practice too. I developed something called physical inspired synthesis. This is it's a strange name to say that I want to I have a system that creates sounds that are not real, but they could be real, like are real enough, so to speak, or plausible enough. They sound like real instruments, but they are not real instruments. That was kind of the original idea. And it gives some space for invention, because you have now the sound of a piano that can last for like 20 minutes, or the sound of a bass drum that is like pitched like a tiny, teeny wine glass or something. So there is a space for invention, because you see a physical body that is as a strange sound, so associated to that. So this kind of discrepancy between the sound and the source would actually generate interest in music. The way it works is that you have a sensor that you place on a physical instrument. For example, imagine a bass drum. You do some analysis on this sound and you generate some sounds, but the sounds are injected back into the instrument. So there is a couple of objects. One is called the sensor, or the piezo microphone, and the other one is the transducer. So there is an object that vibrates and is actually attached to the instrument itself. So both the sensor and the transducers are placed on the same instrument, and in between there is some sort of analysis and synthesis that I perform. Just to give you a hint of what happens, there is some sort of understanding of what's going on, and this is mapped onto some musical parameters. In this case, we see a kind of a low-pitched gesture and a high-pitched gesture that becomes two different notes. But this is just an example. Of course, you can map this information in any way you want, and I'll show you what I do actually with these type of things. So this is at the center of one important work of mine that is, it's a cycle of pieces called Les Espaces Physiques. That is a piece for augmented percussions. And when I say augmented, I mean that these percussions actually have sensors and transducers, and they are wired together, and they actually are connected. So a number of percussions become a single instrument that is connected together. The original idea was that I didn't like these disconnection between the instruments on the stage and the sounds of the electronics that was coming from the loudspeakers. Like this piece at Salle Pleyel had a number of loudspeakers on the audience, but the orchestra was still on the stage. So they were not really connected. So I wanted to preserve this kind of global space by the electronics, but also preserve the local space of the orchestra or the instruments. So what I decided to do was to put the electronics inside the instruments and the instruments around the audience. That's the idea of instrumental inversion, what I call instrumental inversion. I designed a number of pieces. There are 4 pieces in this cycle. Only 3 of them have been performed for the moment. The last one will be performed in May in Italy next year. And let me give you a quick overview of the 3 pieces. One is called Inside Out. That's the idea. You put the intertracks inside, and then you put the instruments out somehow. And this has been, it's for 4 percussionists with augmented percussions that are around the audience. And this has been performed in Paris in 2017. I want to give you an example of, at the time I was calling these instruments smart percussions, and I felt stupid doing that, right? So there is kind of a strange thing that when you compose for an instrument, you usually know the instrument. Suppose I want to compose for piano, I actually know the piano, and then I compose for it. But in this case, I was composing at the same time both the music and the instrument. So you feel, right, it's very difficult to be creative when you don't even know what are the possibilities of the things that you are developing. So to just give you an example of these, I want to show you a very quick, simple example. I will show you how I play one instrument, and this instrument is played into another one, that is played into another one, that is played into another one, that is played back in the same instrument to make a feedback loop. So this would generate a new sound that is not really any of the instruments that you are playing. So in this case, I'm playing a bass drum, and the bass drum is played inside a metal plate. The metal plate is played inside the tam-tam, and the tam-tam is played inside the piano, and the piano is played back inside the bass drum. So when you change the dynamics, you change the timbre of the instrument. So this is basically a feedback effect, or a Larsen effect, if you are familiar with this effect. When you put a microphone close to a loudspeaker, you get this kind of whistle, right? But you can control it, and you can tune it and make music with that. This was the principle behind this piece. The second piece is called Core. Core is for 6 percussionists around the audience. And in this case, and I mentioned that because it would be some sort of consideration I want to do at the end of the talk, the space was an essential component of the piece. The piece has been performed in a hangar, a very large space, and the musicians were like 50 meters apart. So it took like few seconds to understand your action. So you play your own instruments. This instrument is played in another location of the space that is pretty far away. And then at the same time, the other person is playing their own instrument, and this creates some sort of feedback. So the space is essential when you create music. You always need to take into account the space of your music. I will comment on that later on. So again, I start from a kind of an abstract representation of this piece. You see here how I was imagining at the time the form of the piece. You see this kind of figure in which you see the things connected together. This would be a feedback kind of effect. And then let's play a few minutes of this piece. This is a performance that has been that happened last month in Montreal by an ensemble called the Sixth Room, 6 percussionists. Okay, thank you. So this piece played when you are in the same space has a very different effect. It's a kind of a very physical experience. You have these kind of vibrations around you, and you feel inside an instrument. So it's a very, in fact, the cycle is called les espaces physiques. You need to experience that in the place, in the moment where the piece is performed. So you cannot really go on YouTube. You can actually go, but the feeling is not the same. And this brings me to the most important point of the context. And this is the end of my talk. So there is another piece called Dendrum that is for two instruments, also played and part of the cycle, but I will not talk about that. Let me try to make some conclusions here. I don't even know if there are conclusions. I'd like to define two things, okay? So this experience with these augmented or smart instruments made me understand that the context is everything. There is no music without space. You have no sound where there is no space. So you need to compose for the space and the time. You have no choice then being in a context and understanding your actions are actually determined by the context. So you compose a piece for a specific venue or for a specific time in a specific moment to be played at that time. And if you want to listen to this piece, you need to go there and experience the piece, not to go online and experience the piece online. This is a very important difference between before and after electricity. When you started being able to reproduce music indefinitely at a different level, loudness than the original one, like you could hear this Beethoven symphony very soft, even if it is supposed to be played very loud. And you can play it without having an orchestra in front of you. That makes a sort of disconnection between the sound and the source. And unfortunately, today, most of our acoustic experience relies on not having the source in front of us. So we mostly listen to music using headphones or loudspeakers and on YouTube or iTunes. We don't go to the concert that often. Like I would say in my case, it would be like 90% on YouTube and 10% to the concert or something like that. That's not right. We hear in a different way, and so we speak in a different way. And that affects very much our perception of the world in an acoustic sense. This brings me to two concepts that I'd like to propose today. One is called musica hic et nunc. That means music now and here. And I would define that as the act of composing, taking into account space and time. So you can compose not only the notes, you also compose the venue, and you compose the moment. You compose everything, and everything is part of the score. I'll give you two examples of these, and I encourage you to go online and check for this music. Paulino Oliveros was a composer that was active in the Bay Area, and he was used to compose music for cisterns, like very large tubes of, for water that were, hanging empty in some countries. And these cisterns have a specific feature. So they have a reverberation tail of more than 40 seconds. So if you do that, inside that, you get 40 seconds, the sound repeating itself. So you need to compose, keeping in mind there is a polyphony generated by the space. Each time you do something, you will have something that has been played 40 seconds earlier. So you need to compose using the space as a parameter for your score. This also means that you cannot play these pieces here because that makes no sense. They are supposed to be played in that cistern. And so they have this specific long reverberation tail. And if you remove the context, this music has no meaning. Walter Branchi is an Italian composer and gardener, as he defines himself. And he composes a piece called intero, that means whole in Italian. And this piece is made by a single note, A3, that is meant to be played once in a single place. So it's basically, his whole life is composing a single note to be played once in a single place. And this place is his garden, actually, in Rome. I've been there. So this is a lifelong composition that he composes little by little, but it's a single unified piece. So if you want to experience this piece, or at least the section of the piece that is now on, so to speak, you need to go there, to his garden, sit and wait. And what happens is that you hear the garden, like the birds, the river, And then at some point you hear some sounds, and it's actually a note, a single A. And then this note becomes louder, more evident, and then at some point it fades out again, and you hear the garden again. The only meaning is that you use the note as a background for the garden, and you realize the context where you are. So the context becomes the music. In this case, it's an extreme provocation. Like, this music is just about not having any music, just about being in the present, just about listening to the world around you now, in this specific moment. So this is a kind of a very interesting approach for me. It's not in the top 10 in iTunes, I suppose, but this is a very interesting conceptual interpretation of what means making something for now and here, musica hic et nunc. This relates to the second concept that I'd like to present, that is, I call sonic grounding. That is a therapeutic technique that involves doing activities that reconnect you to your sounds. So our body produces sounds. We have voice, we have, any type of sounds. So we need to know, well, the sounds we produce. This kind of reconnection is an essential activity for me in order to be creative, because I think in sounds. So I need to know what are the sounds that my body can produce. And I have a number of techniques to do sonic grounding. I use usually my voice, and I do that, these type of techniques, each time I have to do something that is creative in a way and involves sound. For example, before this talk, I was grounding myself using my voice. I will not demonstrate that now, but I will give you an example of what is sonic grounding for me. And I will give this example using a composition of mine, the last one, it is a short one. This piece is called Ali oscillano in fioco cielo. I really don't know how to translate that in English, Greg. I think wings oscillates in a weak sky, or something like that, okay? And this is from a poem by Salvatore Quasimodo. And this is a story of a fall. So, ali oscillano in fioco cielo, something starts in the sky. And then the last verse is e giorni una maceria, and the days ruins. So it's really grounding down the floor. Is the story of a fall. So I use this small poem to compose a piece for a madrigal for 5 voices, sorry. And this was an extremely important moment for me in my life. I was grounding there. This was kind of a moment in which I was down, and I just wanted to come up again. And so let me play this piece, and this will actually conclude my talk. Thank you very much.
Hello, Discover here to explain our cashback match. Here's how it works.
Okay. I don't know if you have any questions.
We have about 10 minutes for questions. Are there any questions on Zoom? Okay, let's start there. I'll give you a microphone.
So Valerie asks, if a piece is performed in more than one location, do you make adjustments because the contexts differ?
Thank you for the question. These are a very important question. This piece that you just saw, Core, for 6 percussionists, has been played twice for the moment. The first time was in this big hangar in Milano, and then the second time was in Montreal in a very technologically advanced place called the Kermit. There is nothing in common between these two places, and so this required an extensive work of adaptation to the score, the technology, and the practice of the piece. So there is an essential part of my work that is being there to deliver my music. So the score is not my music, the performance is. So in other words, at the moment, I don't know how to detach from my music. I need to be there and help the musicians to perform the piece. And so I'm somehow part of my work. I'm looking for better ideas, but at the moment, that's what I do. So I basically redo the thing from scratch every time. Yes.
There's one other question from Vincent. Dr. Cella, I would like to know if you plan on using the computer again in your music and what you think are the scientific challenges for making music more in the future. Many thanks for the great talk.
Thank you so much. So yes, I do plan to use the computers. I never stopped actually. So as I mentioned, I composed this piece when I was 6, and I wrote this code for the Commodore 64 when I was 6. So I never stopped since then. So I don't see myself changing that much. So I'd like to continue, but it is true that the perception I have of technology is changing very much the more I go on in my life. At the beginning, I thought it was an essential part, and it's becoming less essential. It's becoming more inspirational, so to speak. I use not really the outcomes, I use the process. In other words, today I showed you what I do for composing this piece, like Stade d'Ombre using Orchidea, but it's not meant to be said. It's some sort of private thing that I do in order to be able to compose the piece. And it doesn't need, the audience doesn't need to know. The piece speaks for itself. I mean, I wish it could speak for itself. So I don't think about technology anymore as an essential tool. It's more an inspirational tool for the moment. And I'm looking forward to see how this will affect my Musikereket Nunc in the future. Thank you.
All right. Yes, go ahead. Thanks for those questions, Sumi.
Thank you so much for your lecture. I definitely enjoyed it. So in the past weeks in this class, we've learned about like finding creativity within blank space and like working with limitations. So do you have any thoughts on like the importance of blank space, or I guess in this case, silence in like music composition? And have you faced any challenges or limitations that ended up supporting your creative process?
Thank you. Limitation and resources are an essential part of the creative process. I agree. The first piece called Inside Out that I didn't play here was using a specific device developed by IRCAM called the Koala. It was a very complicated, technologically advanced thing to make these kind of resonances in the instrument. Then the Koala died, unfortunately. So between the first and the second performance of the piece, we had no more of the technology. And this made me thinking that we needed to find a solution to keep the piece alive despite the technology. So convey the same poetic ideas with more limitations. Limitations are a mean to achieve something in the creative process, most often than not. I like working with extreme expanded technologies like this piece for like 3D audio layers and a number of speakers and very complicated technology. But at the same time, I like using very little technology to find new ideas for my inspiration. For example, this piece that I didn't play, Dendrum, is the third of this cycle and comes after the other two that were even having new devices developed for them. But this piece only uses guitar pedals. So I oversimplified the process. I streamlined the process as much as I could. And I finally did the piece with 4 guitar pedals that you can buy on Amazon for $100. So the idea was that I realized, I think in this cycle of 4 pieces, that the technology is not the poetic of the piece. The piece is the poetic of the piece. The technology is just some support, inspirational support, that I use to convey this idea of instrumental inversion, to have this kind of embedding space in which you feel the source, but you feel immersed, but it's just me. And the real point is the music. So again, I would say, I really hope that my music speaks for itself. I don't need to speak about my music or explain the music of the technology. I actually want the technology to be hidden. I don't want you to realize that there is something going on while you hear this piece. Because this would be not an aesthetic experience, not it would be an analytic experience. You will be analyzing my music, not experiencing my music, and it's a no-go. So if you want to create a connection on a kind of intimate and poetic level, you need to focus not on the technology. The technology should be hidden behind the poetics. That's basically the idea for me.
There was an aspect to the question about silence, and that I thought was intriguing, and maybe you can address that as well.
Yeah, thank you. I would say that one way to think about music is a space in which you have some limits. This space, in fact, I oftentimes think about music as a topology. There are different spaces in music. You know, I already touched on the fact that without a physical space or a so-called projective space, there is no sound at all. So you need a space to have a sound. But at the same time, music has different type of spaces. One is called the inner space, so the timbre, and then the outer space is the form. That's how I define my own topology. So the limits of this space are, in my opinion, noise and silence. So there is some creative work that you can do at the limit of the noise kind of region, and something that you can do at the limit of the silence or silent region. There are composers that actually focus their own works on these 2 levels. Like Lachenmann is a German composer, works mostly on noise, but Sciarrino, an Italian composer, works mostly on silence. And so many other composers find their own space in this kind of separation between silence and noise. In my personal experience, I'm looking more and more towards silence. I guess I'm aiming at shut up. That's the point. Thank you.
Okay. Got a microphone.
I really enjoyed your lecture. I thought there was like a nice mix of like humanism and technology. My question is more about like visuals and how you use drawing and like computer generated models to create. There are just so many strong visuals in your project, in your presentation. Yeah, like how do you use like, there's obviously like a human hand component, and then how does that transfer? Like how does the humanness transfer into technology, or how do you use drawings and visuals in your work?
Well, I don't think there is a single answer so probably every piece is different. The short answer would be, I think in sounds, then I make a visual representation of these sounds in time. That would be composing for me. Composing means to lay out sounds in time. And this is a very abstract representation, I agree, that I can only decode in a sense, and I only know what this means. But then there is a number of translations, so to speak, from this stage to the final piece. And the interesting thing, I didn't really touch, so my mathematical work is about representations. I don't think I can, I'm not sure we have time here, but this question you ask is at the center of my work, as like my scientific work. And let me show you one single slide, maybe this could be helpful. Yes, this one. Music information can be thought of as multiple levels together. One is the level of signals, this is like the oscillating sounds, but this is somehow created by some other levels that are, for example, the score. The score is a symbolic representation of signals, but the score itself is a sort of translation of the ideas that you have, these kind of pictures I do. Well, it turns out that each one of these levels has different properties. For example, the speed is not the same, or the dimensionality is not the same. And then I try to unify these levels using a single concept, that is the concept of representation. And I look for scalable representation that can go from the low level of signals to the high level of ideas. So the aim for me is to connect these, you remember this metaphor of the sea, the symbolic space with the signal space. Can we connect them? Can we go from one to the other in a kind of fluid way? And that's basically at the center of my work, yes. My scientific work. Thank you.
Is there a final question? Yes, one final question. You got it.
I just want to say thank you, Professor, for the talk. It really captivated my interest in a way where it's like you're able to combine math and like computer science and like music into this like new like language essentially. And throughout your pieces, I could visualize almost for me as if like your pieces could fit in like a video game, or more so like the horror genre, where it's like whether you're being in a chase scene or a boss. It could apply in films also. And something that I wanted to ask you is, have you ever considered your music to be able to be implemented in new media, such as games or films?
Short answer is no. I didn't find yet a way to have the same type of, to tell the same type of story using other media than music or sound itself. So I'm not a multimedia composer. I definitely work on music. But I think that one keyword here is collaboration. I think that I don't want to start learning how to do visuals or to use my music for visuals, but I think this music can be associated and can inspire some other artists that can do other type of languages, because the languages I don't know how to do anything else than sounds. That's my problem, okay, or my feature, I would say. So yeah, I don't think I didn't do anything like that. So, but I agree on something. Let me show you one last thing before we close. I agree on something. No, it's not here. Sorry. I wanted to show you one thing. No, it doesn't work. I wanted to show you one thing. Okay. Never mind. I don't know. Yes, here we go. Hello. Is it? Sorry for that. Here we go. Okay. I'd like to pitch something. I just started a new course at Berkeley called Computational Creativity for Music and the Arts. It's a breadth requirement course, so everybody can access. There are no pre-requirements, so it's filling up. So hurry up if you are interested. In this course, I will try to address the questions that I also discussed in this talk. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
You're wonderful. So we're at the end of our lecture series, but we're at the beginning of a lifetime of creative expression. And that feeling can be summed up as inspiration. And I want to thank you for giving us more inspiration, and you all for giving each other so much inspiration this semester. Thank you so much, and cheers and onwards.
Thank you, man.